Okay, the last part of the Regents exam, and we're still doing the June 2023 U.S. History Regents, is the Civic Literacy Essay, as it's called. This is a big DBQ. So you're going to be writing a full-sized essay and using the documents that they provide you with. Civic literacy essay question is based on the accompanying documents. The question is designed to test your ability to work with historical documents, etc. So what are the keys to doing this? So first of all, reading what they give you. They give you historical context. Women's suffrage. Suffrage, we know, that word you should know, means the right to vote. So suffrage, universal, white, male suffrage was what happened in the early 1800s. At first, only Americans who were white and male and owned land could vote. Then it was white, male, and owned property. It could be land, but it could be a business, and you had to own a certain amount of it. Then it became universal white male suffrage, so all white males could vote, adult white males. At the time, adult meant over 21. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment, so 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the law, 15th Amendment says you cannot stop somebody from voting based on race. But it doesn't say anything about gender. Women from the 1860s till 1920 were fighting to get their own right to vote, suffrage. All right. So they want you to read and analyze the documents. You're going to look at them one at a time, and then you're going to write a big essay. Describe the historical circumstances surrounding this issue. Explain efforts by individuals, groups, and/or governments to address the issue, and discuss the impact of the efforts on the United States and American society. The question is always the same. They will give you documents. It could be about anything. It could be about any issue in American history. But they will always give you these three tasks. You have to describe the historical circumstances. That means outside information must be in there. Second, efforts by individuals, groups, governments. That means plural, at least two. So in addition to providing outside information that gives the context, you must also talk about at least two individuals or groups or governments, or a combination, an individual and a group, or a government agency and an individual. But it's got to be more than one. And finally, you have to discuss the impact on the United States. How did it change the United States, and how well did that work? In some cases, people fought for something that they never really got. So you're going to have to describe this. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Once again, when we read these essays, what do we find? Students do not tell us anything outside of what is in the documents. You can't get full credit for that. Or they talk about only one group or one person. You can't get full credit for it. Or they leave out how well the efforts worked and what difference it made on society. If you don't discuss that, you can't get full credit. How many documents should you use? As far as you possibly can, all of them. The more you use, generally speaking, the better off you are. You can still get full credit if you leave, say, one of them out, but you're risking that. Why not try the fuller answer? The more you give us, the more reason you give us to give you full credit, the better off you are. So let's take a look in this case. They already tell you this is all about women fighting for the right to vote. Okay, women's suffrage. So we take a look. Here's document 1. Years before the Civil War, actually always look at the source first. Jean Baker, Introduction to Votes for Women, The Struggle for Suffrage Revisited, 2002. This is a history book. This is not a document from the time. You should remember women get the right to vote in 1920, or at least you remember around then. This is a later book written about the history of the period. So in the years before the Civil War, American women began to campaign for the vote, a campaign for the vote that lasted nearly 75 years. Their battle finally ended in 1920, when the 19th Amendment prohibiting the denial of the right to vote on account of sex was adopted. Initially, suffrage was one of several reforms intended to end the significant legal, political, religious, and cultural discriminations against 19th century women. 19th century is 1800s. In the 1840s and 50s, activists targeted injustices, ranging from child custody laws that favored fathers to prohibitions against women speaking in public. That's true. Women were not allowed to give speeches in public for a time. It included the denial of equal education. There were no colleges at that time that allowed women to enter. The existence of a double sex standard. What they're talking about there is, if a guy fooled around on the side, well, it wasn't particularly endorsed, but hey, guys are guys. If a woman fooled around on the side, she was looked down upon. In language and vocabulary familiar to a generation whose parents had lived during the Revolution and who remember the Declaration of Independence, women at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention resolved, among other injustices, that all laws which place her in a position inferior to that of man are contrary to the great precept of nature and therefore no force or authority. What do they mean? 1848, at Seneca Falls, which is a town in upstate New York, the women, the original mothers, if you like, of the women's suffrage movement met, and they issued a Declaration of Sentiments. It reads almost like the Declaration of Independence. And the people of 1848, many of the people who had fought in the Revolution were still alive. They certainly all could recognize the language from the Declaration of Independence, demanding their right to vote. A necessary transaction in any democracy between the people and those to whom they delegate authority, suffrage emerged in the 1860s as both a powerful symbol of equality with men and as an instrument of reform. What does that mean? Transaction is an activity. When you buy something at the store, that's a transaction. So choosing people, electing a guy to be your representative, that's a transaction between the voter and the person being elected. And so because it represents power the people have over their elected representatives, women saw that as a symbol of an equal voice to men in society in general. Even though they had all these other legal problems, if they could get the right to vote, it gave them the possibility of getting someday all those other rights that they talked about up here. Equal child custody laws, and being able to speak your mind in public, and getting an education. Voting became the essential political utility by which women could achieve other improvements in their status. If women could vote, went the argument of the first generation of suffragists, they would end the barriers at the state level that prevented married women from controlling their wages and attending state universities. If women could vote, given their acknowledged position as moral guardians of their homes, they could reform the corrupt practices of American politics. If women could vote, they could end unequal pay. Okay, so this first document here is a historian explaining why the vote for women was so important. Really, to women, the right to vote was only one part, and once they got that, they could start to change the laws in general. That's the idea here. Okay, now for document 1, notice they then give you a question. According to Jean H. Baker, what was one historical circumstance that led women to seek the right to vote? You get a point for this. This is before you write the essay. You have to answer a question on each of the documents themselves. You have to answer the question. So if you just write, and kids will do this, the right to vote, or they wanted to vote, or kids will copy the first sentence here. In the years before the Civil War, American women began a campaign for the vote that lasted 75 years. There were kids who will simply recopy that sentence. Is that a historical circumstance that led women to seek the right to vote? No. What drove women to seek the right to vote? Well, you can say child custody laws were considered unfair, or women were not allowed to attend college, or married women were prevented from controlling their wages, their income. Any of those would be a correct answer here, and that's all you have to do to get the point. But if you just repeat the question or write the first sentence out of the document or something, you don't get the point. These are freebie points if you do them right, and they can make a difference between passing and not passing. Okay, document 2. You get 2 pieces here. One is this. The suffragettes, this is, again, source, Peter Jennings and Todd Brewster, The Century, Doubleday, 1998. Again, it's way too late to be a document of the time. Maybe you recognize it as a history book. The Century was a famous history book. Lucy Hessler learned about the suffragette movement while attending meetings with her mother in Washington, D.C. in the early 1900s. The suffragettes had a big headquarters in downtown Washington, almost across from the Supreme Court building. My mother would take me up there on Sunday, so this must be some kind of a diary or letter from this Lucy Hessler. So Mom would take her up when she volunteered to help out with mailings. I remember helping out by folding letters, licking envelopes, doing all sorts of things. The backbone of this suffrage movement was composed of well-to-do, middle-class women, both Republicans and Democrats. So it wasn't the very rich and it wasn't the very poor. It was comfortably middle-class women of both political parties. There weren't many working-class women in the movement. Why not, you might wonder? Well, working-class women were way too busy. A well-to-do middle-class woman of the time wouldn't have had to have a job and might have a maid. It was very common for middle-class people not to have 100 servants, but to have 1 or 2, a cook or a maid or a cook and a maid, which would free up a middle-class woman's time to go to these things. Most of them, meaning the working-class women, were too busy working to get involved. The suffragettes organized pickets and marches and rallies. It wasn't anything comparable to the violence that the British women were going through for their fight to suffrage. You may not remember this from Global, but in Britain, in England, women were also fighting for the right to vote. And that got pretty brutal. They got beaten up. they got jailed, they got force-fed. They would go on hunger strike, refuse to eat, so they would ram a tube down their throat and force-feed them. Things were pretty rough in England. In America, it never really got that way. Those women in England, it means those women, were being arrested and beaten and jailed. Nothing like that happened here, but there was a lot of agitation. So typically, women in America would go down and they'd carry signs and march around and that sort of thing. At the most, they were usually, if anything, they were maybe arrested and then turned back over to their family and told to go home. Okay, so that's 2A. 2B is the first picket line, College Day on the picket line, February 1917. February 1917, you might remember, is World War I. We've got the World War I era here, and that's President Woodrow Wilson. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? What will you do for women's suffrage? Woodrow Wilson was one of those progressive era presidents. The progressives were all about political reform. These women were, for the most part, progressive thinkers in favor of those political reforms. So Wilson kind of fought against women's suffrage, and they said that's kind of hypocritical and inconsistent. So they're outside the White House here. Maybe you don't recognize that, but you can guess that they're protesting for the president to pay attention to them. Okay. So based on these documents, what was one effort made by suffragettes to gain support for women's suffrage? Should be easy. Once more, don't just, copy the first sentence here. The suffragettes had a big headquarters in downtown Washington. That's not really an answer to the question. You could just say, they picketed. They held up signs. It's not a great answer, but it's sufficient to get the point. You could talk about they organized pickets and marches and rallies. They sent out mailings. Any of that would be considered an answer to that question. Argument 3A, or document 3A. Many men showed interest in the arguments of the anti-suffragists. So just like you had women who protested in favor of women's rights to vote, you had organizations set up to oppose their right to vote. Headquarters of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. And they have a storefront there, and you see 5 guys lined up, and there's a woman kind of looking like she's looking at the guys, I think. I will say this is not in the document here. There were women who actually were not in favor of women's right to vote. They thought politics was a dirty business. Men had been corrupted by seeking too much power, and if women got involved in that, that pursuit, it might make women get greedy for power and wind up getting involved in bribery and corruption too. There were women against women's right to vote. But for the most part, it was guys who didn't want to give up the power they had. Here you see document 3B. This is from Judith Harper, Susan B. Anthony, A Biographical Companion. They don't give you the date, unfortunately. You might guess from that, though, it is a history book. Again, Judith Harper is a historian. This is not a document from the time. Susan B. Anthony, of course, one of the most important leaders of the women's suffrage movement. Okay, we read the document. From the inception of the women's suffrage movement, inception, fancy word for beginning. From the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, through the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Remember, to change the Constitution, you need an amendment. Amendment must be approved by both houses of Congress with a 2/3 vote each, and then must be approved by 3/4 of the states. It's got to go out state to state to state. 3/4 have to approve. That's ratification. Then it becomes part of the Constitution. So from the beginning of the women's movement through ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, that's the one that gave them the vote, there are women and men who vigorously opposed it. Anti-suffrage individuals and groups obstructed the enfranchisement of women for a multitude of reasons. Don't forget this word here. Suffrage is the right to vote. So is franchise. The franchise, as it's called, is the right to vote. Again, another old-fashioned word. So enfranchisement is giving a right to vote to the women. Early anti-suffragists of the late 1860s and 1870s were primarily concerned that the ballot, that is the right to vote, would disrupt women's domestic and maternal roles and create disharmony in the family. So, domestic, that's at home, and maternal, that's motherly. So what if a woman wanted to vote Republican and the husband wanted to vote Democrat? Well, that's going to lead to a fight between husband and wife, and they'd be so busy being interested in politics, they wouldn't have time to be moms. That's the argument that's being made here. Horace Greeley, you may remember, was one of the big abolitionists and was one of the most influential anti-suffragists of the era. So he's pro-abolition of slavery, but against giving women the right to vote. Asserted that the vast majority of women had no interest in voting or in politics. So Horace Greeley, a guy, claims women don't really want to vote. 1871, conservative domestic authority Catherine Beecher and the wives of General William Sherman and Admiral John Dahlgren delivered to Congress a petition containing 1,000 women's signatures pleading with Congress to desist, to refrain from, to not, that is, enact a law enfranchising women. So this is the wife of General Sherman, the wife of Admiral Dahlgren, and this writer, Catherine Beecher, all had 1,000 women sign this petition saying women shouldn't be allowed to vote. Beecher, in her book, Women's Suffrage and Women's Profession, proclaimed that if women were given the vote, most would consider it an overwhelming burden that would cause them to shortchange their domestic duties. So if they could participate in politics, they wouldn't have enough time to spend time as mothers and wives. That's the argument here. Other early arguments that persisted throughout the women's suffrage movement included the following. Women have all the rights they need already. The ballot, the right to vote, will degrade women by causing them to mingle in the dirty, corrupt world of politics. Women don't need to vote because their husbands already vote for what is in their interest. So women don't need a voice because the husband knows what they need and he'll vote the best way for them. Women don't vote when they have the right to do so, an argument based on occasional low voter turnouts in some municipal elections in states where women already had the vote. So there's nothing in the Constitution that forbids women from voting. There's just nothing at this time that requires that they be allowed to. Individual states had the right to allow women to vote. So understand what they're fighting for. 19th Amendment said no state could bar a woman from voting. Before that, a state could bar a woman from voting, but they could also give women the right to vote in their state. And so they claimed, well, in those states they have the right to vote, a lot of women don't vote. So why bother giving them the right to vote? That's the argument here. Based on 3B, state one reason for opposition to the efforts to gain women suffrage. So a good answer here, one that I would be comfortable giving full credit for, is not women have all the rights they need. That is not the answer. The correct answer would be they said, or some people argued, that women have all the rights they need. So you're stating the reason for their opposition. It's not a fact. These are the opinions of people who were against women's right to vote. So it's not statement of a fact there. You can't state it as a fact. It's the opinion of this group of people. That's how you have to put it. Some people thought that women didn't need to vote because their husbands already vote for what is in their interest. That you could write. But don't just write one of these lines. Okay, document 4. Taking a new look at the women's suffrage movement in the feminist movement, 2002. Again, this is a history book about the time, not a document from the time. But it should not deceive us. This struggle was waged every bit as seriously as any struggle for equality, and we would do well to consider how women were able to do what men have rarely even tried, changing society in a positive and lasting way without violence and death. Interesting. So he's saying, usually when guys change society, they do it with a violent armed struggle. Here, they're changing society without violence. Like the now celebrated civil rights movement, women's suffrage records the recent and useful experience of ordinary citizens forced to fight for their own rights against tremendous odds and social inequities. So inequalities, inequities, these are ordinary people fighting for their rights. Here are models of political leadership, of women organizers and administrators, activists and lobbyists. Here are the first women lawyers and doctors and ministers, the first women candidates, the first women office holders. Here are stories of achievement, of ingenious strategies and outrageous tactics used to outwit the opponents and make the most of limited resources. Here are new definitions and images of women in our national life, which give a more accurate picture of the past and which help explain the way American women are treated today. The suffrage movement offers a unique window onto the emergence of women into American political life. This is where many of the intelligent, active, politically oriented women of the time denied their right to participate directly in national politics went. They put their energy into attacking social problems directly and organizing among themselves locally and nationally for their own rights. Okay, now the question you get is, according to Robert Cooney, what is one impact of the efforts to gain women's suffrage? You sort of, you can't just copy a sentence here. Impact, new definitions they created. This is what you would have to say. They created new definitions and images of women in our national life. They bring the first women lawyers and doctors and ministers, the first office holders who were women. You can't just copy a sentence at the top. So you've got to read and see the implication here. Next document. Oops. Document 5. So this, we again always look at the source here. Elaine Weiss, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, 2018. Again, a very recent document, so you know it's got to be a historian writing about the period rather than a primary source from the period. The lessons of the women's suffrage struggle deeply influenced later American social justice and advocacy. That is, public interest movements. The lobbying, public relations, and grassroots organizing techniques developed by the suffragists, as well as their use of nonviolent protests and civil disobedience, stood as a model for mid-century African-American civil rights campaigners, anti-Vietnam War protest groups, and gay rights activists. Notice what they're saying here, by the way? Their use of nonviolent protests and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, you remember, is when you refuse to comply with a law that you consider immoral. You're willing to accept the consequence. You get arrested, you go to jail, and that's your form of protesting it. The women who did this to get the vote stood as a model for African-American civil rights campaigners, that would be like Martin Luther King, anti-Vietnam War protesters, gay rights activists. No doubt the future will bring more causes, more necessary repairs to American democracy, and more need for passionate civic activism. According to Elaine Weiss, what is one impact of the efforts to achieve women's suffrage? Good answer here would be that the women's suffrage movement proved the usefulness of nonviolent protests and civil disobedience that was then later used by African-American civil rights campaigners. That would be a good answer for that. That would get you the point. Okay, document 6A. Again, Anne Brown. Despite gains, women remain underrepresented among U.S. U.S. political and business leaders. Pew Research Center, 2017. Very recent document. You might not know the Pew Research Center is an organization that does a lot of polling and statistical research on society. Jeanette Rankin made history 100 years ago this year, 2017 document, when she took office as the first female member of Congress. I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last, the Montana Republican predicted after winning election to the U.S. House of Representatives. Rankin was right. In the centuries since she began her service as a member of Congress, hundreds of women have followed in her footsteps, but women remain underrepresented in all major political offices and top business leadership positions in the United States. What's the point that's being made? Women got the vote. They did start to get elected to office, but as the document says, if half the population is women, our population is women, half of the members of Congress are not. So they are not represented in proportion to their numbers. Okay. They show you this in this graph. 21% of the Senate is women. Well, if half the population is women, that should be, at least theoretically, something more like 50%. 19% of the House, 21% of the cabinet, that is the president's cabinet, 8% of governors, 24%, 25% really, 24.8% of state legislators. Fortune 500 board members. So Fortune is a magazine, now an online magazine about business. The Fortune 500 are the 500 largest businesses in the United States. CEOs and board members, board of directors, that is, of these corporations, 5% of CEOs and 20% of the board. So here you see, if women are 50% of the population, they're really 20 to 25% of most of these leadership jobs, and in cases like governor and CEO, they're under 10%, barely over 5% here. Based on the documents 6A and 6B, what is one impact of achieving women's suffrage? Well, you could say achieving women's suffrage means that there are now women in Congress at all. There were 0 back when women got the right to vote. Now there are not as many as there are percentage-wise. Not as many in Congress as there are in the population percentage-wise, right? But they're in there at all. You could also point out, as we said before, women getting the right to vote have proven that they can do this, although they are unrepresented. So you can proof of concept that they're able to, or proof that they have, even though not as many, maybe not as successful as some people would like. Okay, now with those 6 documents, you then have to write your essay. So you have to describe the historical circumstances surrounding this constitutional issue. Once more, you must use outside information. A good piece of outside information to use on this one might be, if you can remember, Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, back at the time of the Revolution. John Adams, of course, one of the key guys who helped to get independence. He was one of the editors of the Declaration of Independence. He was our second president. He was our first vice president. His wife, just at the time he was writing the Declaration of Independence, said, "Remember the women." She wrote him that famous letter in which she urged him, this new country that you're building, remember the women. It's always the men who fight the wars and the women who suffer in them. Don't forget us. Well, Abigail Adams didn't get what she wanted. It took until 1920 for women to get the vote. That's a piece of outside information you might use. You might also talk about the abolition movement of slavery. What has that got to do with this? Abolitionism, around the time of the Civil War, included an awful lot of women leaders who hoped that when African American slaves were freed, that they would be treated as citizens, and so you'd have black citizens, and that white women would also be part of the picture, having pushed for abolition, that all people would be treated equally. It didn't really happen for women. Black men got the vote, in theory, in 1865, the 15th Amendment, as we talked about. Women didn't get the vote till 1920. So all of that could be historical context you bring and outside information. You want to explain the efforts by groups, individuals, and or governments to address the constitutional civic issue. So you could, for instance, go back here. You might talk about in terms of historical context, document 1, and I would strongly suggest that you don't necessarily quote from the document, but that you make specific reference to something it says, and then put a bracket and doc 1 or document 1 in the bracket as a kind of footnote. It makes it easier for your grader when they are reading it to go into it and see, aha, yes, you've used all the documents and you're using them the right way. You can then use this to talk about the situation women were in terms of historical context. Document 1 talks about women were discriminated against in child custody laws, in denial of equal education, in control over their wages, and etc. So you could use that for that. Efforts you need by different groups. So you could talk about women, both Republicans and Democrats, from document 2A, gathering together to do mailings, to protest, to do pickets and marches, and we have pictures of a protest here. That's one effort. You could talk about pull down here, document 4. Is it document 4 I want? Hang on. Oh, you could talk about in document 3B, you could talk about the counter argument that was being made anti-suffrage as part of the context, people who voted, who were against it, and the impact then, you want to talk about the impact involved in it. You can use document 4 and 5 and 6 to talk about the fact that women were using the office to get better laws to protect them, that the very tactics they were using were going to be influential as models for anti-Vietnam protests. So it changed how we do political protests in this country, the nonviolent and civil disobedience stuff. And the impact, you could say, it had impact in that it put women into Congress at all, even though that impact is not everything the women perhaps expected, in that they still are a minority, even though technically they're a majority. They're actually 51% of the population. You might know that from outside information. So that would be how you put those documents together. You have to talk about historical context. So outside information you might know, let's say you know that there were women in the Revolution who were arguing for voting rights back then. You talk about the situation they're facing with child custody laws and discrimination in education from document 1. So now you've got a document, outside information. You talk about the organizations that were doing picketing and that were doing mass mailings, that were marching around in front of the White House, or at least marching around in public protest. You can also talk about other groups who address the issue. It doesn't have to be that they supported it, also addressing the issue. So this is a second, at least, group, are those opposed to women's suffrage, and you can talk about what they did from document 3A and 3B. So now you've got two groups involved, you've covered that. And then the impact, you can talk about the changes in attitude, in tactics for other social groups, and the fact that women did win that 19th Amendment and did get elected to office, even if it wasn't as successful as they would have liked. And you covered all your bases for this DBQ.